This is Lois Whealey for Women Today and Yesterday. My show today is going to be about genealogy mostly. I know there are a number of people that have that as a hobby, a favorite hobby. I got involved with it about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, for the first time really. But I found it an interesting addition to my general interest in history and women's history. So it's not just the fathers that count, but also the mothers, you know. The first thing I want to talk about is my T-shirt from Connecticut. Now, it's something I often wear during the Christmas season, and because of the red and the green. But the picture is of the mountain laurel, which is the state flower of the state of Connecticut. And one of my mother's ancestors came from Connecticut long ago. His name was Ranney. R-A-N-N-E-Y, Ranney, and he moved to near New Albany, Ohio. So those were Ohio roots that I actually discovered in the 1990s. I hadn't been aware that I had Ohio roots and had already lived in Ohio for about 30 years before discovering that. It was through my great-grandfather, John H. Ranney, who was actually in the Civil War. He was in the Civil War from Franklin County in the state militia, you would say. In fact, he joined the militia as soon as the war started in 1861. And it was for Franklin County, as I said. So, but they didn't actually go from Franklin County to the battlefields until 1863. However, before that time, he had gone down to Cincinnati. His unit had gone to Cincinnati during the winter of 1861-62, and he'd been quite ill, as a matter of fact. He might have even had, I mean, when I say quite ill, he might have even had pneumonia at the time, and he was only 17 at that time. Then later on, when his unit was sent to Virginia, to the James River, he had another sickness, which was probably, you know, a fever. In fact, practically everybody in the unit had that sickness, bad mosquitoes or whatever. And so he was, again, quite sick. And the upshot was that I think that he really suffered during his lifetime from what today we would call PTSD. He was hospitalized several times for bad health, not only physical but also mental. And in fact, he ended his days in 1917 in Kansas in a hospital that was actually for veterans. And so, like I say, that seemed to have been quite a bad experience in terms of affecting his life. That was John Ranney. Well, his father, Joel Ranney, came from Connecticut with the mother, Elizabeth Mary Graham, and they actually moved to Ohio fairly early. Well, they came first. He came first before he was married in 1820 for a while, and he went back to Connecticut and married Elizabeth Mary Graham, and they returned to Ohio in 1830. So their family was born there, here in Ohio, with my great-grandfather, John H. Ranney, being one of the younger sons of the family. Born in 1846. As I said, he was only 17 when he first served in the Civil War. I guess I said 1861, but that would have been 1863, wouldn't it? I'm mixing up my mathematics here a bit. But this Connecticut connection was important for him and his subsequent family. He was the father of my grandmother, who was Elizabeth Mary Ranney. She was the oldest girl, born in 1871, and she was named for his mother. In fact, by then it was his late mother, since Elizabeth Mary Ranney died in 1869, shortly after the Civil War. By that time, John H. Ranney, by the time my grandmother was born, John H. Ranney was homesteading out in Kansas. Now, you know, the Homestead Act was passed in the 1860s, which made it possible for and encouraged many people to move to the West to find vacant land, vacant except sometimes for the poor Indians who had to move on usually, many of them going to Oklahoma, to Indian Territory. I don't know that that was the case in his case. I do know that he settled in Kansas, northern Kansas, very close to the Nebraska border and near the Republican River, which eventually flows into the Missouri. Of course, the Missouri is the big part of the western river that eventually makes it to the Mississippi. So here's someone who had come from the Ohio region, close to the Ohio River, like I say, New Albany, Franklin County, and of course, actually they lived on Blacklick Creek, which flows into one of the tributaries, one of the big tributaries of the Ohio. So there's something that we all know, namely that you need to live near water where you can get water for both drinking and farm purposes. And so it's very important. They, in fact, in Ohio, they lived right on the one corner of their property was on the Blacklick Creek itself. And it was up by what is today Route 161 that goes from the greater Columbus area over to Newark. So those are Ohio routes that I have, but Connecticut, as I say, was the original home of the Ranneys, and then later moving on to homestead in Kansas. So the Connecticut is not the only river in my background. You know, the Connecticut is the largest river, probably, in New England. It separates Vermont and New Hampshire and flows down from north to south, ending up in the bay, of course, which is an arm of the Atlantic. They were from Middletown on the Connecticut, which is where there's a big bend in the river before it flows on into the ocean. And so Middletown was a very important part of the background for the Ranny family. I do want to show you also a picture which shows my grandmother, Elizabeth Mary Ranny. That's then Hatch. And this is a picture of, she's in the middle there, the lady in the middle. That's Elizabeth Mary Ranny Hatch and her husband, Elmer Ellsworth Hatch, who was named for one of the first martyrs of the American Civil War, Elmer Ellsworth, who was killed across the Potomac River from Washington in the very first days of the American Civil War in April of 1861. He was born, my great-grandfather, in New York State, so, and very close to the big river in New York, which is the Hudson, which runs north and south, and of course flows by New York City itself before entering the bay there. So that picture shows my grandparents, Elizabeth Mary Ranny Hatch and Elmer Ellsworth Hatch. He was actually a minister, a Northern Baptist minister who had graduated from the first class of the University of Chicago, which was formed by the famous and very wealthy John D. Rockefeller, also an Ohio native, and then later on, when he had a large family like this, minister's life being somewhat precarious in terms of money and so on, he began farming out in Kansas, and it was there that my mother was born. The picture shows my mother in the upper right-hand corner, and that was taken when she was in high school. Actually, by then, the family had just moved to California to be near her grandfather, Hatch, who lived in the area just to the west, pardon me, just to the east of Oakland. That shows, of course, the whole family with my Aunt Alice with a big bow in her hair. She was born in 1905. And the other woman is my Aunt Josephine, the oldest of the children, who I knew very well because she lived in Sacramento when I was growing up in Nevada. And we used to go down, my mother driving down to California, to Sacramento, to visit her sister, Josephine. And the younger ones that you see there are the boys, my uncles, with Worth Hatch in the middle, the youngest boy, Lawrence, at the left, and on the right, my Uncle Dean. They were a nice family, good-looking family, did pretty well for themselves. They all had children, except for my Aunt Alice. And I was very close to my Aunt Alice and her husband, my Uncle Shelley Krasno. They lived near Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia. So that's a bit of a picture of the Ranny Hatch family. And I want to talk now about Middletown, Connecticut. We're back to Connecticut and to Middletown itself, which, as I mentioned, is about 40, 50 miles from the ocean on the Big Bend in the Connecticut River. And across from Middletown was East Middletown, which has had several names over the years, but I believe is now called Portland. anyway, that is where the Rannies lived in. John Ranney, a great, grandparent, moved to East Middletown in 1705 from Middletown itself, Upper Middletown. I have here a tome, a real tome. See how big it is? This is called Middletown Upper Houses. And I was very lucky as a person interested in genealogy to discover that there were a number of printed accounts of some of my ancestors, including ones in this Middletown Upper Houses book, which was published over 100 years ago. This is actually a reprint of the 1905 publication of Middletown Upper Houses. And it does include my great-grandfather's name, his family, but not any more, actually, not any closer to 1905. It does mention my grandmother, however, Elizabeth Mary Ranney Hatch. And one of the interesting things I discovered about this book was that in addition to the regular part, which begins with people back in the 1600s, they have a supplement at the end, and a brother of my great-grandfather put into that account the interesting fact that my great-grandfather was a Universalist in Ohio. Universalism was quite a popular religion. There were a number of, they didn't have too many churches, but they had a number of churches that hosted traveling ministers who were Universalists. Universalism has to do with a belief in universal salvation. The Universalists got started back in the 1790s, and with the belief that a loving God would not condemn many, many people to hell, which is the more accepted theocratic idea, was certainly in 1790s, that hell was going to be the destination for a number of souls. But the Universalists believed in universal salvation, the salvation of all souls by the loving God and the loving Jesus Christ. So it mentions in there that the father of John Ranney was a believing Universalist all his life, and his home was a welcoming place to visiting Universalist ministers who came to preach. And there is a Universalist church, an old Universalist church on the road 161, just over from Franklin County, and then just barely in the next county east, which to this day is a place where meetings are held on Sunday. However, I believe they have a different kind of minister, not a Universalist minister nowadays. We have visited there. In fact, I have a nice picture of my son David taken on the day that he and I visited that old Universalist church on Route 161, which is just a couple of miles east of New Albany, Ohio. So Middletown Upper Houses contains a lot of information about Rannies. In fact, there are several hundred pages of Rannies in that book. That's one of the reasons it's such a thick book, is there are so many Rannies listed and dating back to 1668, when John, and his name was also John, Ranny married a woman. Well, I should remember her name, but I know her name was definitely Mary, and started the whole large family of Rannies that eventually spread out from Connecticut to Ohio and many other places around the country after 1668. So Connecticut, though, is the starting point for all those Rannies. Now, of course, they aren't the only people in my background. As I mentioned, my grandmother was Elizabeth Mary Ranny, and she married Elmer Hatch. But one of her mother was actually from New York State, from the Hudson River area. Her parents had gone to Homestead in Kansas, and that was where, like I say, up on the Republican River near the Nebraska border, Clyde, Kansas, that she met and married John Ranny. Her name was Mary Josephine Manning, and her father was John Manning, born in 1825, who married Lana Dubois, or Dubois, who was born in 1830. They were married in January of 1854, and my great-grandmother, Mary Josephine Manning Ranny, my great-grandmother, was born in November of 1854, the oldest of their children. Well, they were a Kansas couple, of course, but as I say, stemming from not only the Connecticut River, but also the Hudson River in New York State. I have some pictures here of the Huguenots, the Dubois or Dubois, which is the French pronunciation, simply means of the woods. The Dubois or Dubois family, who settled near the Hudson River. The first of these Dubois came over in 1660. We have a picture here of Huguenot Street, Huguenot Street, or Huguenot, which is the French pronunciation. The Huguenots were the French Protestants that got started in the late 16th century in France, and so they have this French name, Huguenot. They are also the original refugees. Refugee is a French word, actually, because it refers to the fact that the French Huguenots, the French Huguenots, or Protestants, were very often refugees. First of all, from France itself. They got started up in northern France. The Dubois family got started in northern France, but they had to leave because the Catholics ran them out. The Catholics being, of course, the majority religion in France, not only at the time, but still. So the French Huguenots went, first of all, to Germany, to the Pfalzland sometimes called the Palatinate. That's where the word pulse comes from. They moved to, when they moved to New York in 1660, they lived in a town, well, not right away. Right away they lived near Kingston, New York, but they moved within about 17 years to New Paltz, a place they named New Paltz on the Wallkill River, which flows into the Hudson, for the Palatinate refuge that they had had in one of the German states before moving to the New World. So the picture that you saw is called the Dubois Fort. The reason it's called a fort, it certainly doesn't look much like a fort, and I think we'll see another picture of it again after a while. The so-called fort was, when it was built in 1705, the New York state authorities were still quite worried about American Indians who were not too keen on moving away, although they eventually did. But in 1705, the New York authorities wanted the big house that the French Huguenots built in New Paltz to be possibly used as a fort. And that's why on the side that you can see, the stone side, which is in the picture that we'll see a little later on, there are two holes big enough for a rifle barrel to be stuck through them, so that the big house could be used if there was an Indian attack by the inhabitants, putting their rifles into the one in each of the rifle holes that were left in the side of the building just in case. And Huguenot Street in New Paltz has the homes of a number of families who were French Huguenots, and including, of course, this large yellow building, which was the home of the Dubois after 1705. And Matt is going to show us that picture of the Dubois Fort, so-called, on Huguenot Street in New Paltz, New York. The very handsome double porch there was added some years later, I might add, long after there was any need for any thought of any use of the rifle holes that are on the stone end that you can see on the right side, has some white windows in it, and it's gray because it's built of fieldstone from the stony fields of New York, and was built, as I said, in 1705. So that was the home of Lana Dubois' ancestors. She herself was from farther up the river, farther up the Hudson, from Catskill. Catskill Mountains, of course, are a beautiful part of the upper New York landscape, and an even larger area of forest preserve is north of the Catskills. The Catskills form a southern part of it, but New York State, that we think of as quite a metropolitan area, because of New York City, actually has a lot of rural territory, including a huge area of woods. And further up the Hudson, north of Albany, the big lake where Fort Ticonderoga is. I recently joined the effort to build a museum on Ticonderoga Point. I believe it's going to be right in near the Fort Ticonderoga itself, but right now they're just thinking about it. However, I did get a nice hat, which when I sent in a donation for Fort Ticonderoga / Museum of Ticonderoga fairly recently. Also in the background in New York State are the Crispell family. Crispell, whatever. The Crispell family was another Huguenot family that came to near Kingston and to New Paltz eventually. Crispell himself always lived in Kingston, and he's buried there. But his wife was one of the daughters of Matthew Blanchon. And like I say, the important thing, if you possibly can find it, if you're interested in genealogy, is to find publications dealing with ancestors. This is the pamphlet that deals with Matthew Blanchon, and it's called Matthew Blanchon in Europe and America. Actually, they have some interesting legal, I guess you would say, court cases involving Matthew Blanchon, who apparently was a pretty rascally guy and quick to temper, so that he showed up a couple of times, more than a couple of times actually, in court cases in the New Paltz area for fisticuffs, I guess you'd call it, with other fellas. But he was, he had a couple of daughters, and one of his daughters married a Dubois, and they moved eventually to Catskill. Maybe they thought it better to put a little space between them and Papa Blanchon because of his tendency to wind up in court due to fisticuffs. Of course, an important source, again, for genealogists is court records. So maybe it's a good thing if you have an ancestor who winds up a little bit in court, because then you can trace him down in an actual legal document, namely a court document. But I was mentioning Crispell, who also married a Blanchon daughter, Marie. He married Marie Blanchon, whereas Louis Dubois married Mary Blanchon. And, oh no, oh dear, her name was Catherine. How about that? We don't have many Catherines in our family, and that's kind of too bad, since she got started it all got started with Catherine Blanchon, who married Louis Dubois. They were actually married in Europe before moving to the Hudson Valley, and they had several children, several sons, before they moved to the Hudson Valley in 1660. This family was the only family legend that I heard from my own grandmother, Elizabeth Mary Ranney Hatch, because this was the family tradition that Catherine Blanchard and her sons were captured by the Esopus Indians. The Esopus Indians got fed up, apparently, in 1663 with these Europeans moving in to the Kingston area. And they attacked a little village nearby during the Esopus War. And that little village was where Catherine Blanchard Dubois was living at the time. Now, her husband was out in the fields working, and a number of the people in the little village were actually killed by the Indians, but they took as captives back with them up the Wallkill River. They took captive Catherine Blanchard Dubois and her little boys, and also her sister Marie, who had a baby. Marie Blanchard Crispell had a baby with her. And they were all summer of 1663 living with the Indians, so much so that Catherine's son Isaac, playing with the little Indian children, learned enough Indian language that years later he was considered a useful translator of Indian language when he was grown up. He remembered the Indian language he'd learned as approximately a 3-year-old or 4-year-old during his captivity with his mother. That captivity, like I say, was a family tradition story handed down, but it was only until I checked the New York State records that I realized that the Esopus War, the attack was in June, and the captives were held all summer. It was in September before they were released by some of the Dutch and English soldiers in September, finally. But the story was passed down, traditional story, that Catherine had acted up apparently so much that the Indians finally got tired of her, and they were all prepared to burn her at the stake when she started singing. And she sang, "By the Waters of Babylon." You know, that's the refugee song from verse from Psalm 137, about the refugees, the Jewish refugees who were taken to Babylon about 500 years before the time of Christ. And the psalm talks about how unhappy they were by the waters of Babylon when they remembered their homes in the Palestine, the Holy Land. She was singing that song when she was rescued, according to family tradition. That's how she got rescued. She was rescued during her singing of the song before being burned at the stake. Very lucky for me that she was rescued, right? Well, another one of the books that I have that gives information is this book on the Crispell family, and it was Catherine's sister, Marie, who married a man named Crispell, also a Huguenot. And she had a number of children, 3 children at least, before she died as still a young woman. And Crispell married for a second time. Now, one of the interesting facts is that Crispell is an ancestor of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So I share one ancestor with FDR, and that's the kind of thing you sometimes surprisingly find when you look into genealogy, connections with well-known people sometimes, or people with interest, certainly with interesting histories, like the Dubois and the Crispells. Actually, Kingston, you know, is just across the Hudson River, really, from Hyde Park. And Hyde Park was the traditional home of the Roosevelts, who were a Dutch family. That name Roosevelt, and the fact that the double O is pronounced O and not Roo. Some people in the old days when I was young insisted, especially ones who didn't care for him, insisted on calling him Roosevelt. But the Dutch double O is pronounced Roosevelt. The Rose Field, actually, literally in Dutch, in Hyde Park, where Franklin D. Roosevelt's family lived for several generations before himself. And so he is in this Crispell book because his Crispell's second wife was the ancestress of FDR. And it's very interesting. Of course, it's only in the very first part that it says anything about people related to me closely. It was actually Marie Crispell who married Louis Dubois and moved to Catskill in the 1720s. So that's the connection there. It's through the maternal line. And I talk a lot about women, right, on my show, Women Today and Yesterday, which you are now viewing. Well, those are most of the things that I have to show you that have to do with genealogy, but once I got started, finding it so interesting, not only to make real of these people who came before, but also to make connections with American history, as I have with, for instance, Rannies who were living in Middletown, Connecticut in the 1760s, 50s and 60s, were involved in the French and Indian War, because that was when the French and Indian War was going on. England and France were fighting it out in Europe and in Canada, and the French came down from Canada at the time and were threatening people in the Connecticut River Valley, so that a number of Rannies fought in the French and Indian War, one of whom was not only wounded, but eventually died of his wounds during the French and Indian War. So these make connections through genealogy with American history. I've already mentioned the Homestead Act and the fact that the Rannies, John Ranny moved to Kansas during the homesteading time, and John Manning and his family, including Mary Josephine Manning, moved to Kansas during the homesteading time. And after the quite young Mary Josephine, I think she was only 15, when she married John Ranny, who was in his early 20s at the time, and it was one of the things I noticed about genealogy and the westward movement, shall we say, was that there were, that was often the case, that women were marrying young. I mean, just barely women, someone who of 15 or 16, getting married and setting up their own home after their parents had moved to the West during the homestead era. So there's a story about Mary Josephine Manning. In fact, she married her school teacher. John Ranney was teaching school out in Clyde, Kansas at the time, in the late 1860s and early 1870s, and they were married in 1870. He married Josephine Manning, who was born in 1854. So, like I say, quite a youthful young lady when she bore my grandmother, Elizabeth Mary Ranney. So the connections with keep up. Now you notice I'm only talking about my mother's side of the family, and the reason is actually my mother married someone who was a first-generation American. So he didn't have American antecedents very far back, only his own parents who had moved to America, to the United States. Whereas my mother's family goes back, as I've said, to the 17th century, to the 1660s, 1670s, and so on. But the connections that continue with the not only the Civil War, which I've mentioned my great-grandfather served in, but other times. Let's see, did I bring the picture of Great-Uncle Elliot? Well, maybe not. Great-Uncle Elliot was the youngest brother of my grandmother, and she was born in 1871. He was born in 1894. So she was already a grown-up lady teaching school in Kansas when he was born as the youngest child. He was someone who was involved in the First World War. He was in the transportation business. In fact, he made, they say, 11 crossings of the Atlantic during 1916-17, when the U.S. was a part of the European First World War. And he's someone that, of course, was lived to be an old gentleman. So he was someone that I met. Of course, I also knew my grandmother, his older sister. Since I was the oldest grandchild, born in 1932, and my grandmother didn't pass away until she was in her 80s in the 1960s. So, or no, I guess it was 58. 1958, she passed away. By then, she had 16 grandchildren, or was it 15? Anyway, I was the oldest of them, and so I remember my grandmother quite well. She lived with us on several occasions, especially when my younger brother, Bill, was born. That was in 1942. He's 10 years younger. And she came for a while and helped my mother, who was working at the time She was teaching, I believe, at the time. She had been working in the late 30s when I was growing up as a little girl before my brother was born. She was working in the Nevada Employment Service, which was a federally financed job, and she had served in the Nevada legislature in 1937. But I was only 4 or 5 at the time and don't really remember those days. Like I say, she worked first for the Employment Service, and she worked at Hawthorne at the Nevada base on Walker Lake, right in the shadow of beautiful Mount Grant. She worked at the naval base there, where they were training men, particularly flyers. Of course, Nevada is great for flying weather because there's hardly ever any rain there. And so not only Hawthorne, but my hometown of Fallon, as well as Hawthorne and Tonopah, all had bases during World War II, which I remember. We lived in Hawthorne for 3 years, and I can remember going to my first dance as a 6th grader at the USO, because they had a nice USO building in Hawthorne to help, of course, the servicemen, but also community center, became a kind of community center. So that's where I first learned to dance in Hawthorne in 1944, 45. Well, that's a bit about my young youth. It's not about ancestors, but it's about me, myself. You may notice that I'm wearing a shirt that says, Organize Ohio. It has Ohio in big white letters, and it has the word organize in black letters across it. I'm wearing this shirt, a nice red shirt. I don't have too many red shirts, but this is one of my nice red shirts. And it's one stemming from Organize Ohio, set up in the year 2000 with a number of groups around Ohio that were in the organization business, helping people. Rural Action, for instance, was a member of Organize Ohio in the early days of Rural Action's time. Well, actually, Rural Action began in 1985, so I guess I can't say it was, but it was only changed to be called Rural Action in 1994, 95. But it has on the back a long, long list, including Rural Action, of Ohio organizations that help people out, like the homeless, people in poverty, and people who just want to organize for good causes that they believe in. So this is my nice red Organize Ohio t-shirt. And we also have, as you've seen, my Connecticut t-shirt, which is more of a pinky red than compared to the red Organize Ohio shirt that I have here. Well, we're getting down, I think. I see Matt is arriving again. Matt, will you show the t-shirt again, the Connecticut t-shirt? I think we've seen all the things I had. Right, and you notice Connecticut, where the Rannies originated back in the 1660s, and the state flower with the pretty green foliage there is the mountain laurel, which is the state flower of Connecticut. original home of the Rannies who moved to Ohio in the 19th century, making me a person with Ohio roots. I hope everyone has a happy holiday season. It's coming up soon, but you'll need to be careful to stay warm because the weather is pretty cold. It's definitely winter now. But do have happy holidays, everybody. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year from Lois Whealey, signing off for Women Today and Yesterday.